Today, we've got more spooky stories told from the perspective of police officers. Let's get straight into it. I'm your host, Severed Soul. I was working at our local county jail, and while doing my watch tour, I was heading over to medical when I clearly heard two people having a conversation. Initially, I just presumed it was two inmates in a cell talking. I walked to the first cell, and there was no names on the door, so I didn't look in, I just walked to the next cell. As I approached the next cell, I could see that there was one name on the door, so I looked in. I opened the hatch, and there was one guy in there on his own. I didn't say anything to him at first, but as I was about to close his hatch, he asked me if I could move his neighbours over because he was lonely and he'd like some company. I then walked back to the first cell to look into the window just in case somebody didn't put the names on the door. I looked into the cell, and there was nobody there. To my surprise, the cell was completely empty. I went back to the guy in the other cell and asked him if he'd heard people talking in that cell, and he said yes, they'd been talking loads. I informed him that there was absolutely nobody next door, and promptly got out of there. After retirement from the police force, I worked as a security guard in a medical centre. One morning, I was opening the place up at 5 AM. As I walked past one of the alcoves, just for an instant, I saw a young boy, probably about 8 or 9 years old, with scruffy hair and a stripy top, sitting on a bench. I saw him briefly, for just a second, and then he was gone. Anyway, out of embarrassment, I never spoke about this with anyone. I had 8 retired detectives working for me, and one day I was having a conversation with one of the guys. Very sheepishly, he asked me if I'd ever seen anything strange while I was opening the place up in the morning. When I asked him why, he said because he had momentarily seen a young boy sitting on the bench. He described a boy with scruffy hair and a stripy top, sitting in exactly the same place that I'd seen him. Other experiences include coffee pots being knocked over and footsteps being heard late at night when no one else is there. I later found out that the medical centre is located adjacent to the most haunted cemetery in Staten Island. Several years ago, my partner and I were hunting a suspect of a kidnapping in some abandoned houses. It's approximately 3:30 AM. We went to check an abandoned house in a rural and remote part of the city. The house was extremely large and typically creepy looking. When we entered the property, we found that the inside of the house was like something straight out of a Tim Burton nightmare. There were walls going halfway up, then stopping. There were doorways, barely big enough to stick your head through, opening up into massive rooms. Every time we thought we'd made it to the top floor, we'd find another staircase going further up. Finally, we made it up to the attic, where we found some really creepy, crazy stuff drawn on the walls, like pentagrams, etc. Needless to say, we finished clearing the house and got straight out of there. One of our regular callers was an elderly lady in her 80s. Whenever she didn't take her medicine, she would hallucinate and see children in her house. She would call us to report that the children were moving things around in her house and making loads of noise, etc. I've visited this house many times to answer these calls. One time, I was standing with the elderly lady in the dining room of her home, and she was getting agitated because she said she could see the children. I, on the other hand, couldn't see anyone. She looked at me with a really fearful expression on her face and said to me, "Can't you see him? He's been staring at you now for about 10 minutes and he's grinning." While saying this, she was pointing to a spot no more than 5 feet away from me. The way she was saying it with such concern was extremely creepy. But I know it was only a hallucination, right? One cold winter night, at about 3 AM, I was doing paperwork in my vehicle behind a Kmart. Suddenly, out of nowhere, someone or something knocked on my window 2 to 3 times, obviously scaring the shit out of me. The sound was absolutely unmistakable. The problem was, there was nobody there. There was a building 10 to 15 feet away to my right. There was a 10-foot tall fence to my left, and in front and behind me there was 100 feet of open space. There was nowhere for anybody to go. There was nothing but my own tyre tracks in a blanket of fresh snow. No marks on my window or the ground next to me indicating maybe a snowball or something had been thrown. I even got down in the snow and looked underneath my car, but there was nothing. To this day, I still get a bit anxious whenever I drive back there. I work on county roads. One morning, at approximately 3 AM, I had a signal 100, but the nearest bathroom was about 30 minutes away. So, I pulled down a dark gravel road and started my business. Straight away, I felt like somebody was watching me. Looking towards the rear bumper of my unit, approximately 20 feet away from my vehicle, I could see a dark, shadowy figure. I stopped and zipped up and yelled out what I presumed was a person, but I received no response. I started to apologise to the person, thinking that maybe this was the landowner and they'd come to see who was peeing on their drive. But again, no response. I then went into tack mode and demanded that this person show me their hands and identify themselves. But again, they said nothing. At this point, I started to feel really uneasy about the situation, so I aimed my flashlight over in their direction. As the light passed over that area, that figure was nowhere to be seen. Keep in mind, I was talking for at least 20 seconds, and I clearly just saw somebody standing there. I looked around the area, but found no sign of anybody. The ground under my feet was thick with leaves. I couldn't make a single step without making a noise. There's absolutely no way that this figure could have run away without me hearing it. I turned around to get back into my unit and took a quick look behind me. To my horror, I could now see this shadowy figure approaching me from behind. Needless to say, I got straight into my unit and hightailed out of there as quickly as possible. One year, at around Halloween time, our department started receiving complaints that headstones were being knocked over in the local cemetery. The chief advised us on the night shift to spend a little bit more time hanging around the cemetery to try to catch the culprits in action. Me being sneaky, I found a really good observation spot about a block away. There were two major, well-lit streets providing a little bit of light onto the cemetery. For several nights, I would frequently stop off and check the cemetery with my binoculars, and only actually patrol the cemetery at the beginning and end of my shift, as usual. One night, whilst observing the cemetery, I saw what I can only describe as a cat walking on its hind legs. I watched as it walked approximately 10 feet in between two headstones before it faded away. I rushed over to the area in my car, turning on my spotlights, alley lights and takedown lights. I couldn't find anything apart from a track through the dew that dead-ended at one of the headstones. To this day, I can remember exactly how it moved and the outline of this thing that I saw in my binoculars. It was really creepy. I'm an avid hunter and I've done plenty of hunting at night. I'm really familiar with all of the animals in my neck of the woods, but I can honestly say I've never seen anything that looked like this. I responded to a suicide as a co-lead detective. A male had hung himself on a tree in the backyard. We thoroughly checked the outside of the residence, and both entry doors were locked with a deadbolt. I called for entry tools and the supervisor for breach because the guy's girlfriend who he lived with was still unaccounted for. It was very possible that we were investigating a suicide and a murder. I was standing with several patrol officers on the south side of the building at the back door. This door had been checked multiple times whilst we were waiting for entry tools. I looked at the door for a second and noticed a small gap between the frame. There was now no deadbolt thrown across. We checked the door, and to our shock, it was now open. We cleared the residence, and there was definitely, absolutely nobody inside. I even had them clear the attic space. Inside the door that magically opened, there were multiple notes written to the family members of the decedent. We all walked back outside where we waited for the next of kin to arrive. When we attempted to enter the house once more, it was now, again, locked with the deadbolt. It should be noted that there were key locks on both sides of each door, but nobody had the keys. The lead investigator and I were now discussing how once again we were going to have to call for entry tools. However, as we were in discussion, the door opened by itself. Nobody had gone anywhere near that door. Once again, I had the residence cleared, and again, there was absolutely nobody anywhere inside. The lead detective and I did not go back into that house that day. The jail I worked at had a notorious ghost called Sarah Ware. Sarah would frequently play with the lights, flicking them on and off, and set the alarms. Most of the alarms in the jail are panic alarms. These panic alarms are situated in offices where they have to be manually pushed and slid into a slot to be activated. We got to a point where some of the officers were too terrified to go into the courthouse whenever the alarm was activated. I was one of those officers. That last one actually gave me goosebumps. I really hope those stories give you nightmares. Please don't forget to like and subscribe for a feast of grim and grisly content. Leave any thoughts in the comments section down below. As always, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.